Hello my dears and welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon. This back here is Bernard. He's my October co-host. He's more the strong silent type, so I do most of the talking. Anyway, here today I'm going to be talking about my 5, actually it's 6, favorite scary books. These books are great any time of year, but they are especially good this time of year in October when, you know, you're already feeling sort of the spooky vibes with Halloween coming up. Maybe you're watching scary movies, and these are just the perfect reads for that time of year. It's hard to narrow it down, and let me just tell you, Stephen King takes up 3 of the 6 spots on this collection of books, and picking which 3 to put in was difficult because, of course, depending on the day when you ask me what my favorite Stephen King books are, that's going to change. And it's also going to change depending on, you know, what kind of scare you're talking about. Or maybe you want to know about the ones that aren't scary. But the one that always kind of tops out the list of Stephen King books is, of course, The Shining. And it's funny too, whenever I talk about The Shining, I think about that scene from Friends where Joey's talking about how when he reads that book, he has to put it in the freezer because it scares him so much. And for whatever reason, he just feels safer when it's in the freezer. And that's understandable because it is terrifying. The Shining is one of those stories that just gets right under your skin. You know, it's the story of a writer, a man named Jack, who takes a job at a secluded hotel in Colorado. And him and his family are going to move there and care for the grounds while the hotel is closed during the winter. And so it's a story of isolation and madness and a haunted hotel. And there's so many layers to it, and there's so much going on, and everything that's going on is terrifying. And mixed in with all of that, the stuff going on with Jack, he's also got a son, a young boy named Danny. And Danny's very sensitive to paranormal activity and experiences. He's kind of like an open vessel. And all of the very scary things that are happening in the hotel, he's able to see and hear and feel more than anybody else. Although it's Jack who's the most affected by the energies, it's Danny who feels them the most. And it's just such a phenomenal, scary book. Then, of course, years later, it was made into a film by Stanley Kubrick. That's pretty good too. I love watching the movie. We watch it pretty much every October because it's so scary. The book and the movie are pretty different. The general story's the same, but there are a lot of things that are changed or added or taken out in the movie. And I would suggest, even if you've seen the movie, give the book a read. It's really good. The second book, and what made this a 6-book list instead of 5, is that I wanted to include the sequel to The Shining, and that is Dr. Sleep. This came out just a couple years ago, many years after King had written The Shining, and this is a book about Danny years later and how his life was after they left the hotel. And I remember when I heard this book was coming out, I was excited, but there was also a part of me that was a little worried about it because when you have such an iconic book and then you're writing the sequel to it, that's gonna be so much pressure. And like, what if it's not as good? And what if it doesn't do justice to the story? But it did. It was so good. It's not quite as scary as The Shining, but it's just the perfect companion to it, so I had to include it on the list. And if you've ever wondered whatever happened to Danny Torrance, this tells you. And, you know, if things aren't great when the book starts out, he's, you know, he's an alcoholic like his dad was. Like, things are grim, but throughout the course of the book, we find out the ways that he's beginning to be able to take those sensitivities and his knowledge of the paranormal and the otherworldly things and use them to help other people and just sort of make his life better. It's just great to get that follow up and that conclusion to Danny's life. Next up, we have another absolute classic, and this is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. This story scares the crap out of me. So this story is about Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse. And they move into a very exclusive apartment building in Manhattan, one that's, you know, it takes a long time to be able to get to move in. They've heard of some, you know, kind of weird things that have happened in the building, but they don't really care. They want to get in there and live. Even though not only have they heard, you know, really weird things about the building, their friend, a close friend of theirs, actually urges them not to. But they never listen, do they? No. Anyway, so they move in. Rosemary becomes pregnant. They befriend an elderly couple that lives next door. And as time goes by, you start to feel that there's something not right about the building, about the couple next door. There's just something not right. And again, this is one of those books that's really heavy in atmosphere, which I love. Just that slow building dread. And this is just the perfect example of that. It's terrifying. It's well written. It's the perfect scary book. Next up, we have Ghost Story by Peter Straub. I did a whole book talk video on this book last October, so I won't get too deep into it, but I will link that other book talk down below in case you're interested in hearing more about this book, because it was great. What actually made me pick this book up at first is there's a blurb on the back from Stephen King, and it just says, "The terror just mounts and mounts." And I was like, okay, I'm in. Let's see. So basically, this book is about a group of men who get together every year or every month. I can't quite remember, but they get together quite frequently, and they tell each other stories, some true, some made up. And as we're getting to know them through these stories, one of the stories begins to come back and sort of haunt them. And I found it a bit of a slow read when I first started it. I was like, oh my goodness, am I going to get through this? You know, it's not one of those books that you can't put down. But the payoff for it is great, and I found it to be really eerie. Again, a lot of build-up, which I like. I don't like being thrown all of it at once. I like the build-up. And this book was fantastic. Would definitely recommend. One of my favorite things that Stephen King writes are short stories. I absolutely love his short stories. He's the absolute master. And short stories are one of those things that are really easy to write badly, basically. You know, you think when you have a novel, you have so much space and time to be able to unpack a story and then pack it back up at the end nice and neat. But with a short story, you've got to pack such a massive punch in such a short amount of time. And I'm just always blown away when someone is really, really good at it. And Stephen King is the absolute master. Now, when I was going through the collections of short stories of his that I have, it was hard to choose. I wanted to choose the book that has the 1408 story. If you've seen the movie that was made into 1408, starring John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson, it's absolutely phenomenal. And it's one of my favorite of his short stories. And the movie was excellent too. And it stuck so closely to the book, which I loved. Or not the book, the story, which I loved. And John Cusack was amazing in it and was fantastic. So my original instinct was to include that short story collection in this video. But in the end, I went with Full Dark, No Stars. Which, first of all, I just love that name. I love that name. Second of all, this book is so good. It's so good. It has the story 1922 in it, which was recently made into a Netflix film, I believe. That's one of the things about Stephen King is so many of the movies that have been made based on his work are made from the short stories. So I mean, that tells you what kind of quality we're working with here. Anyway, 1922 is absolutely terrifying, and the story is so scary. I can remember reading it in bed, being so tired, needing to sleep, but also not being able to put it down until I finished that story because I needed to know how it ended because I was so scared. And spoiler alert, the ending didn't make me feel any better. Anyway, it's fantastic, but honestly, you can pick up any of his short story collections and really not go wrong. And speaking of short story collections, I have another one to share with you, number 6 on this list. Although I guess technically number 5. This is another collection of short stories. And this is 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. Joe Hill is actually Stephen King's son. Joe Hill is such a fantastic writer in his own right. I just love all of the books he's put out so far. He's put out, I think, 4 or 5 at this point, and I've enjoyed them all. But this one is the short story collection, and it's absolutely fantastic. I went back and forth between including this book and including Heart-Shaped Box, also by Joe Hill. But in the end I went with this because, like I said, I love a good short story. What I love about these stories is some are scary and some are just weird, but they're weird in such a way that they're so entertaining. So again, if you love short stories, if you love being scared, you can't go wrong with Joe Hill. So there you go, you guys. That is this year's collection of favorite scary books. One that I really wanted to put in this list but didn't was Misery by Stephen King. That's one of my all-time favorites as well. It's so scary because it's about a super fan. I think it's something that's so interesting to think about, especially during these YouTube times when some of these kids on here with these massive channels are so famous and popular with the kids. Like reading something like Misery, so that's about where a super fan of a creator, in this case it's an author, kidnaps him, you know, ties him up in her home, makes him write stories the way she wants them to end. Like, it's an intense story. So that one gets an honorable mention. I was also going to include The Haunting of Hill House on this list, but I didn't, only because my last video a couple days ago was a video entirely about The Haunting of Hill House. Not so much the book, but I did touch on there enough that I think if your interest was piqued, you'd want to pick it up from that. I don't need to ramble on about it anymore. Anyway, you guys, thanks so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments below, what's your favorite scary book? I'm going to be doing a favorite scary movies video closer to Halloween, and yeah, then that'll pretty much do it with the book Talkoween content. And for those of you who aren't into scary things, don't you worry, we're going to have all kinds of lovely, delightful Christmas content coming up soon. A little softer, a little more joyful. Anyway, thanks again, you guys. I will see you on Monday with a Marcia box unboxing. Until then, I hope you have a great weekend. Bye.